The year was 1944, and Germany was starting to lose the war. German groups were falling apart on both the east and west sides, and many soldiers were being captured. These included not just men, but also women who worked as nurses, communication staff, helpers, and sometimes members of special support groups who had followed the Wehrmacht into areas they had taken over. For years, Nazi messages had warned them about how bad it would be if they were caught by the enemy. They were told they would be embarrassed, treated badly, and even killed. But when they were captured, especially in Western Europe, things were surprisingly different. In the late summer and fall of 1944, the Allied armies moved quickly through France and into Belgium. As towns fell one after another, German groups that were leaving behind small groups of women helpers, often working with anti-aircraft teams or medical centers. Some were caught at field hospitals, and others while working on communication tools. They were usually captured suddenly as Allied tanks arrived faster than expected. In these confusing times, fear was the main feeling. Stories spread that women helpers might be treated worse than men, singled out for revenge, or hurt by soldiers wanting to make the defeated enemy feel ashamed. With the war still going on, these women expected the worst. Instead, many were shocked when Allied soldiers, especially Americans and British, treated them with a strange mix of firmness and politeness. The prisoners were searched. Any weapons or papers were taken away, and then they were taken to areas where they would be held. One German nurse later remembered in her book how she had prepared for hits or insults, but instead was given a blanket to keep warm in the evening. Another, who worked as a signals operator for the Luftwaffe, recalled how American MPs offered cigarettes to scared women, something so unexpected that it felt unreal after years of messages. The first shock of being captured often led to confusion. These women had lived through constant bombings and tough orders from their own leaders. But here, while being held by the enemy, they saw acts of kindness. In the first weeks of being held, they were walked or taken to temporary gathering spots, where the Allies tried to separate military people by rank and job. Women were often kept away from men to avoid any problems, but they were not treated badly. Some were amazed to be given food, white bread, butter, and coffee that they had not seen since before the war made food harder to get in Germany. The Geneva Convention of 1929 was very important in how the Allies acted. Even though it wasn't always followed perfectly, the Allies generally tried to stick to its rules, especially for prisoners from the West. German women prisoners quickly realized that how they were treated was based on international law and the desire to show that they were better than the Reich, not on revenge. In American camps, they took extra care to record the capture of women, both for paperwork reasons and to stop rumors of bad behavior. The women themselves were confused by how careful everything was. They had to fill out forms, lists of things they owned were checked closely, and there were strict rules to make sure they were not harmed. One of the biggest surprises was about cleanliness. After days or weeks of leaving and being tired, captured women were taken to buildings with washrooms and showers. At first, they were suspicious. They wondered if these showers were some kind of trick. Sad reminders of rumors about gas chambers spread even among German staff. But when warm water came down and they were given fresh towels, they couldn't believe it. It was strangely one of the first times many of them had felt really clean in months. This experience set the tone for what being held would be like, an unexpected world of order, routine, and physical comfort that was different from the dirt and lack of things in their falling homeland. The first days of being held were not just a change from freedom to being locked up, but from fear to amazement. German women, prisoners who were ready to be treated cruelly, found themselves in a place that changed their understanding of the enemy. What started with shock at being captured soon turned into something deeper. They slowly realized that Allied camps might offer a level of treatment and kindness that was impossible to imagine. In their own collapsing Reich, when the trucks and trains carrying German women, prisoners finally arrived at the permanent P camps, another stage of amazement began. After long trips through the war-damaged areas of northern France and Belgium, many expected cages made of barbed wire, mean guards, or crowded, dirty pens. But in Britain and the United States, the Allies had already set up large internment facilities that worked with surprising efficiency. Camps like those at Aldershot in southern England or Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, America were not just thrown together holding pens, but controlled environments built to handle tens of thousands of captured soldiers. For the women, their arrival broke more ideas that had been carefully created by Nazi messages. When they entered the compounds, they went through a careful but orderly process. Allied officers wrote down each woman's information, checked her rank and job, and often separated medical staff from communications helpers or office staff. The process felt like a lot of paperwork, sometimes even cold, but it didn't have the embarrassing show they had expected. Women were not paraded through angry crowds or laughed at as traitors. Instead, they were taken to barracks, sometimes former military training areas, or quickly built wooden huts that still had solid roofs, windows, and heating. Compared to the bomb-damaged ruins of German cities they had left behind, the barracks seemed surprisingly normal. What surprised many prisoners most was how orderly and clean the camps were. Floors were swept every day, beds were lined up in straight rows, and every new arrival received basic bedding, mattresses filled with straw, blankets, and even pillows. This was not as fancy as home, but for women who had spent weeks on the move, it felt almost luxurious. One Luftwaffe helper later said in a statement collected by the German Red Cross that she had been shocked when shown a washroom with soap, mirrors, and individual sinks. She had not seen so many hygiene supplies since she was a child. The Allies also made sure to keep the sexes separate, a rule designed to keep order and avoid accusations of bad behavior. In American camps, female PSWs were kept in separate compounds guarded by both male and female staff. While the guards were watchful, the treatment remained proper and professional. To reassure prisoners, the Red Cross was allowed to do checks from time to time. These checks confirmed that the women could get medical care, enough food, and the chance to write letters home. For many German women, the most confusing part of arriving was the food. The first meals in captivity often had things that had long disappeared from the German diet: canned fruit, coffee with real sugar, eggs, and white bread. Wartime shortages had made these things rare luxuries in Germany. But here they were, served by the enemy as part of standard food. The effect on their minds was strong. Prisoners who had been taught to believe in Allied cruelty now faced the reality of getting consistent food. In fact, American food for PSWs was designed to meet Geneva Convention standards, and was sometimes almost the same as what U.S. soldiers got. Daily roll calls and camp routines made the sense of structure stronger. Wake-up calls, checks, and scheduled mealtimes gave the women a rhythm that was different from the chaotic retreats of their final months in the Wehrmacht. Allied officers often reminded them that following camp rules would keep things orderly. Over time, this sense of predictability reduced the fear of the unknown. The terror of being captured slowly turned into the strange reality of being cared for, even if reluctantly, by the enemy. What none of them could have guessed was how different the environment of these camps would be from life back in their homeland. While families in German cities suffered from hunger, bombings, and being forced to leave, the women inside Allied camps were experiencing regular hygiene and even small comforts. Their arrival was more than just losing freedom. It showed them a completely new view on life during war, one defined not by cruelty, but by unexpected kindness. Once the first shock of arriving faded, the daily routine of being held began to shape the lives of German women prisoners. What surprised them most was not just that they were not being treated brutally, but how much attention was given to hygiene and personal dignity. Each camp had clear routines. Mornings started with roll call, followed by giving out supplies that included soap, towels, and sometimes sanitary items that had been almost impossible to get in Germany by the final years of the war. For women used to shortages and rationing at home, getting such items from the enemy felt both unreal and unsettling. One of the greatest luxuries was the chance to take regular showers. In camps across Britain and the United States, prisoners were allowed to use heated water on a schedule, sometimes every day, and at least several times a week. This practice was not just for cleanliness, but also to show that the Allies were following the Geneva Convention. German women who had often been on long marches and in rough field conditions first approached these facilities with suspicion. Memories of war rumors about gas chambers made the first times in steaming shower rooms scary. But once they realized that the facilities provided real cleaning and relief, the practice became something they valued. Fresh towels added to the sense of dignity. Each prisoner was given a towel that could be exchanged for a clean one regularly. In war-damaged Germany, where families often had to reuse linens for months, sometimes years, such regular washing felt like a fancy resort in comparison. Women later said in books and interviews that the simple act of drying off with a clean towel after a warm shower made them feel conflicted, thankful for the comfort, but uneasy that their enemy was providing it. The focus on hygiene went further. Allied authorities insisted on checking hair for lice, a common problem in wartime Europe. Delousing powder was given out and clothing was washed according to strict schedules. For the German helpers who had seen their comrades weakened by disease on the Eastern Front, or during the chaotic retreats of 1945, seeing organized laundry stations and medical checks was surprising. It became clear that the Allies were not interested in letting diseases spread through the camps, even among their enemies. Mealtimes also made the sense of order stronger. Food was given out in mesh halls or open-air canteens where prisoners lined up with metal trays. The diet was different, but it often had things that were completely missing from German food by that point: meat several times a week, fresh vegetables when possible, and milk powder. One prisoner remembered being offered an orange, the first she had tasted since she was a child. These meals, combined with the routine of bathing and clean clothing, improved physical health a lot within weeks. Women who had arrived tired and not well fed gained strength, and this physical recovery changed how they felt about being held. The daily routine also included times for fun. Prisoners were sometimes allowed to walk within certain camp areas, play simple games, or sit outside barracks in the sun. Female guards in some British camps watched over these activities, which reassured the German women that rules would be enforced fairly. They compared these conditions with the stories they heard from comrades captured by the Soviets, where overcrowding, hunger, and disease were common. In letters written home, though checked by camp authorities, many women cautiously hinted at their amazement. Without giving details that might be removed by checkers, they noted their health was getting better and that they were treated properly. Families in Germany, struggling to survive air raids and rationing, could barely imagine their daughters bathing in warm water while bombs fell on cities like Hamburg and Dresden. The routine of warm showers and fresh towels repeated day after day became more than just hygiene. It showed a difference that prisoners struggled to understand. How could the enemy, painted as cruel and barbaric, maintain conditions that were better than those in their own homes? This daily contrast wore away at old beliefs and forced the women to face the gap between Nazi messages and reality. As weeks turned into months, another part of being held began to impress itself on the German women: the regular giving of medical care. Allied authorities saw health not only as a humanitarian duty, but also as a practical need. Disease outbreaks threatened guards and nearby communities, so preventive medicine became a key part of managing the camp. The women, many of whom had seen German hospitals fall apart under constant bombing, were surprised to find themselves in places where doctors, nurses, and even dentists checked on them regularly. When they arrived, each prisoner had a medical examination. The process was careful, weight and height recorded, vaccination histories taken, and any signs of illness noted. Those with lice or skin conditions were treated right away, and women with more serious illnesses were sent to special infirmaries. In U.S. camps such as those in Texas and Oklahoma, infirmaries had modern beds, disinfectants, and supplies that were as good as the small hospitals back in Germany. The women were confused when American medics, sometimes helped by German doctors captured earlier, gave them treatments they had not expected to get from their enemy. Nutrition was another important part of medical policy. Allied food was deliberately more than the minimum needed, not just out of kindness, but because healthy prisoners were easier to manage. Fresh vegetables, canned fish, and powdered milk were added to meals to fight problems common among tired Germans. The women quickly noticed that their skin looked better, wounds healed faster, and they had more energy. For some, being held was the first time since the late 1930s that they had eaten a balanced diet. In contrast, letters from home showed sad pictures of starvation in bomb-damaged cities. The presence of the International Committee of the Red Cross made this medical care more believable. Representatives checked camps, making sure conditions were good, and giving out packages that often had vitamin supplements, bandages, and extra food items. Prisoners received parcels that sometimes had chocolate, canned meat, or cigarettes, luxuries that were impossible to get in their homeland. For the women, these packages showed a world of plenty that was very different from the lack of things in Germany. One particularly surprising thing was how they handled teeth. Tooth problems had become common during the war because of bad food and fake sugar that hurt teeth. In camps run by the Allies, women got their teeth checked and fixed if needed. Some helpers even said they had better tooth care as prisoners than they ever had as adults in Germany. This made them feel mixed up, happy for the help, but uneasy that the enemy took better care of them than their own government did. They also cared about how people felt inside. It wasn't as good as what we do now, but the people in charge knew that how people felt affected, how they behaved in the camp. Women who were sad or scared sometimes got easier jobs or more time to rest. Religious leaders from different religions came to the camps to give spiritual help. German women who were taught to be quiet were shocked that they were allowed, even told to talk to religious people about their problems. It was very different from being captured by the Soviet Union. Stories went around about German women sent east where they were starving, crowded, and worked to death. The women in the Western camps were getting shots to prevent sickness, eating 3 meals a day, and getting medical checkups. They knew this was a big deal. It made them realize they could survive and even get better while being held by the Allies. Medical care, which they thought would be bad or mean, became one of the most important things for the women. Having doctors, nurses, and Red Cross people around all the time did more than just make them healthy again. It made them question everything they had been taught about the enemy. Every shot, bandage, or checkup slowly broke down the ideas the Nazis had taught them for years. Besides food, cleaning, and health, life as a prisoner slowly showed German women helpers new things they never would have thought of while working for Germany. Work and school were started in many camps run by the Allies, not just to keep things in order, but to keep people busy. For women who thought they would be doing hard, boring work, the camp jobs were another surprise. The jobs were mostly about taking care of the camp. Women worked in the laundry, kitchens, or did office work like they did during the war. In British camps, they sometimes sorted clothes, fixed them, or helped make food while being watched. In the United States, where the camps were bigger and had more stuff, women might work in sewing shops, making clothes, or fixing bedding. The work was organized, not too hard, and often came with small rewards, like more food or free time. The Allies also knew that teaching people was a good way to change their minds. In some camps, especially those run by Americans, they taught English, simple math, and even history. One reason was practical. Knowing English made it easier to talk to the guards, but it also showed the prisoners ideas that weren't Nazi. The women prisoners, many of whom hadn't finished much school before the war, were curious and took advantage of these chances. Some later said that learning English words or writing helped them feel like people again, instead of just defeated soldiers. Religious and cultural things also changed life in the camps. They had Protestant and Catholic services, sometimes led by German religious leaders who had been captured with their groups. They started choirs and music nights where women sang German songs and new songs the Allied religious leaders taught them. These cultural exchanges were small but powerful. Hearing American or British hymns was very different from the war songs of the Nazi time, offering a softer sound that slowly changed how the women saw the world. Also, Red Cross volunteers sometimes brought reading materials, translated books, magazines, or even newspapers that had been checked by people in charge. For women who had lived under the strict control of Joseph Goebbels' propaganda office, seeing different ways of writing was eye-opening. Even though the stuff they could read was limited, it felt more open and varied than the strict stories of the Reich. Some prisoners started to wonder why their own government had been so strict about what people could see and read. Work also helped build community. In the sewing rooms or kitchens, women from different parts of the military became friends. Helpers from the Luftwaffe, army nurses, or office workers. Without the strict rules of the military, they shared stories of home, talked about how they survived, and made small groups to support each other. Camp life became not just a place to be locked up, but also a place where they unexpectedly supported each other. For the Allies, these things had another purpose: to show that democracy and kindness were better than the strict control of Nazi Germany. The fact that prisoners were allowed to learn, sing, or talk relatively freely was very different from the force used by the government they had worked for. German women often felt this difference, even if they didn't like it at first. The simple fact that they were encouraged to read, learn, and join in left a mark that would stay with them long after they were let go. The work and school programs did more than just pass the time. They slowly changed what people expected. What started as shock at being captured and relief at surviving was becoming something more. A growing feeling that being a prisoner could be a time of unexpected change. The longer the women stayed in Allied camps, the bigger the changes in their minds. At first they didn't believe it and were suspicious. They had been taught to expect only bad things from the enemy. So every warm shower, every meal, every fair action seemed like a trick. But as weeks turned into months, the constant kindness started to break down the ideas the Nazis had taught them for years. One of the biggest changes came from comparing things. The women knew, often from letters or Red Cross reports, that their families in Germany were having a very hard time. Bombs had destroyed cities. People waited in line for food for hours, and whole neighborhoods didn't have running water. But the women in the camps had regular meals, medical care, and clean places to live. This flip in what they expected made them question who they were loyal to. Could it really be that the enemy was treating them better than their own leaders had protected people back home? The stress in their minds was made worse by seeing Allied propaganda. The camps often had posters or news that had been carefully picked to show German losses and Allied wins. Prisoners were reminded that Germany was failing, that Hitler's promises had only led to ruin. Some didn't believe it, holding on to their pride in their country. But others, especially younger helpers who had only known the Hitler Youth way of thinking, started to wonder. If the enemy cared enough to give them food, warmth, and medical care, then maybe the idea that the Allies were bad people was wrong. Personal meetings made these doubts stronger. Some women remembered American guards joking with them or showing them pictures of their families back home. British officers were often strict, but didn't do anything mean without a reason. These small things made the enemy seem more human, which was what Nazi propaganda had tried to stop. A Luftwaffe signals worker later said in an interview that she was confused when an American guard lent her a book, saying she should give it back when she was done. That show of trust bothered her more than any punishment could have. The effect of being clean shouldn't be forgotten. Regular showers, clean clothes, and set routines made the women feel more like they mattered after living through chaos. In a place where they knew they would survive and have their basic needs met, they had time to think. Some started writing diaries, noting the differences between what they had been told about the enemy and what they were now seeing every day. Another thing was that they weren't as scared anymore. When they were captured, many had been afraid of being hurt or killed. Months later, that fear had turned into something like safety. Being safe behind barbed wire was strange, but for women who had seen the destruction of running away and air raids, being a prisoner meant being safe. With less fear, the Nazi ideas had less power. Loyalty to Hitler had grown from fear of the enemy. Once that fear went away, so did the feeling that the government was strong. There were also differences among the prisoners. Some women held on to Nazi ideas, calling others weak or traitors. But even for them, the comforts of being a prisoner created a strange feeling. It was hard to call the Allies inhuman while drying yourself with a clean towel after a warm shower. Younger women were more willing to think about things differently. By late 1945, after Germany surrendered, the changes in their minds were even more obvious. News of Hitler's death, the fall of the Reich, and the trials of Nazi leaders reached the camps. For many, being a prisoner now felt like survival, not shame. The enemy's unexpected kindness had become a mirror, showing how empty the ideas they had worked for were. What started with being surprised by warm showers and clean towels had turned into really wondering about loyalty, who they were, and the very basis of the ideas they had taken into war. As the war ended in May 1945, the feeling inside the camps changed from unsure to nervously waiting. German women prisoners now had a new question. What would happen when they were sent back home? For many, the thought of going back to a destroyed homeland was both hopeful and scary. Letters home that were allowed but checked gave small bits of information about family members, ruined cities, and shortages. These notes were often changed by people in charge, but even the shortest sentences showed the destruction waiting for them in Germany. Letters became very important. Women wrote carefully, not saying anything about camp life that might be taken out. But they tried to tell their parents and siblings that they were healthy. The fact that they could even write to family surprised them, because Nazi propaganda had said that Allied captors would never allow it. Some families, who hadn't heard any news, were shocked to get postcards in their daughters' writing from as far away as Georgia, Texas, or the English countryside. Knowing that their children were alive and from the tone being taken care of, brought a mix of relief and sadness. The idea of being captured by the Soviet Union was a big fear. Stories went around that many Germans, including women who had been captured by the Red Army, were being forced to work, made to walk long distances, and treated terribly. Rumors of people being sent to Siberia were common. Because of this, those in British or American custody knew they were lucky. Women sometimes quietly thanked God that they had been captured in the West instead of the East, something they would have never said out loud while still in uniform. But being sent home didn't happen right away. Allied policy said they had to carefully check everyone to find possible war criminals, political leaders, or people suspected of being in charge of the Nazi Party. For most women, helpers, radio workers, nurses, clerks, the wait tested their patience. They stayed in camps for months, even years after the war ended. During this time, the difference became more obvious. They were technically safe, but still locked up behind wire, fed every day and taken care of. The delay only made them feel more like being a prisoner was somehow safer than the ruined homeland they would eventually go back to. Some were moved to work groups where they helped with farm work or small rebuilding projects while being watched by the Allies. In Britain, German women were sometimes used on farms, picking crops while being guarded. Reports said they worked in fields, ate bread and cheese for lunch, and got paid with credits for the camp store. Compared to being forced to work under the Reich, these jobs seemed almost easy. But the stress got worse as the months went by. Women wanted to see their families again, but many were scared of what was waiting for them. News from home talked about bombed houses, not enough food, and ruined cities. The difference between their clean living spaces and the ruins of Hamburg, Berlin, or Cologne weighed on their minds. Some felt guilty for living more comfortably as prisoners than their mothers and children did in Germany. Being let go often started with medical checks and interviews. Each woman was checked for health, asked about what she did during the war, and sometimes had to sign papers saying she hadn't been part of any criminal groups. Those who were seen as harmless were sent back across the Channel or the Atlantic. But even these trips showed how strange being a prisoner had been. Women who had once been Luftwaffe helpers or Wehrmacht clerks now traveled on Allied trains or ships watched by guards who didn't seem hostile anymore. As they left, many had mixed feelings. On one hand, they had lived as prisoners, without freedom and unsure of the future. On the other, they had been treated in ways that questioned everything they had been taught by their homeland's propaganda. Letters, medical care, warm showers, and clean towels had become signs of a prisoner life that wasn't cruel, but surprisingly fair. These things would change how they talked about the war in the years that followed. In the years after the war, the stories of German women who had been held in Allied camps weren't well known. But scattered stories, spoken words, and Red Cross reports slowly showed how much those months and years changed their views. For many, being a prisoner hadn't been a terrible nightmare, but a time marked by health, routine, and a surprising amount of dignity. These stories were very different from the stories of Germans captured by the Soviets, where starvation, crowding, and forced labor left scars that lasted a lifetime. Historians looking at these differences often point to the role of the Geneva Convention of 1929, which the Western Allies mostly followed. Records from the International Committee of the Red Cross show that inspections of camps holding women helpers consistently reported enough food, bedding, and clean places to live. The small things, warm showers, fresh towels, and clean clothes, became common themes in what survivors said. They were small comforts, but in the context of a global war, they were very important. The long-term impact was more than just surviving. Many former prisoners said that their time in Allied custody made them rethink how they saw the world. The propaganda that had shaped them as young people fell apart when they saw the enemy treating them fairly every day. This didn't always mean they changed their political views right away. Some went back to Germany and tried to forget their service, but others spoke openly, telling families and later researchers that being a prisoner was the first time they really questioned the Nazi way of thinking. These experiences also had a gender aspect. Unlike male prisoners who often talked about work, discipline, and military rules in their stories, women often remembered the routines of being clean, eating well, and going to school. Diaries kept in German archives show how women compared the clean living spaces of Allied camps with the bombed apartments of their families in Cologne or Dresden. The fact that prisoners lived in better conditions than many civilians back home became a common theme in their thoughts after the war. This strange thing fed into the rebuilding of Germany after 1945. Some former female prisoners came back with knowledge of English, basic ideas about democracy, or at least a feeling that the enemy wasn't the monster that Goebbels had said they were. Some of them later worked as translators or secretaries for Allied occupation forces, using the language skills they had learned in the camps where they had been locked up. Others became informal witnesses in their communities, telling younger people that the Allies had treated them with unexpected fairness. At the same time, these memories were often kept quiet. The Cold War made things complicated, and many former helpers felt ashamed for having served the Reich, even in non-fighting jobs. Their stories were overshadowed by the bigger stories of male prisoners or civilians who had lived through the destruction of Germany. But in local histories, stories, and interviews done in the 1980s and 90s, these women's voices started to be heard. They didn't talk about heroic battles, but about warm water in camp showers, the feel of fresh towels, and the surprise of eating fruit after years of not having enough. For historians, these small things are important. They show the big break between what people expected and what was actually happening. They show how small acts of kindness were very important when compared to the cruelty of total war. Most importantly, they remind us that being a prisoner wasn't always the same for everyone. Even though some German prisoners of war had a tough time and lacked things, others, especially women taken in the West, experienced a setup that tried to show it was better by treating people kindly. Therefore, what happened to German women prisoners in the past has two parts. It shows how international rules were actually used during a very violent war, and it shows the surprising ways people can still feel respected even when they are locked up. Remembering things like being able to wash regularly, eat meals consistently, and get medical help became a key part of how those women survived. When they remembered what happened, being held prisoner was strangely both a removal of their freedom and a look into a place that went against everything they had previously heard about the people they were fighting.